Okay, so we're going to do a quick demo on how to use Postman to interact with the Race Manager APIs directly. So generally speaking, most end users will just use the UI, which basically is using these APIs behind the scenes to actually control or change things on the server itself. But if you are a developer or you want some other automated way to do this yourself, you probably have interest in the APIs. So inside of the source code, once you've checked out the repository for Race Manager, you'll find two Postman related files. One is for the environment, which defines variables that are used as part of the collection. The other is the collection itself, which defines all of the different sort of endpoints and parameters and things that get sent. So it's essentially all the HTTP requests that you can make against the server at this time. And we'll try to keep this updated as we update the application itself. So once you've got Postman installed, go ahead and go to open it up and go ahead and go to the Environments tab on the left-hand side. Then we're going to click on Import. And the first thing we're going to do is import the environment file. So I'm already navigated to this folder, but within the Race Manager repository, wherever you check that out on your computer, look inside of the server folder, and then inside of the Postman folder within that, you'll see these two files. The first one is the Postman collection. The second is the environment. So let's start with that environment file. Hit open. You'll see it recognizes it. Hit import. And you're going to see that it finds this environment now inside of Postman. If we click on that, just to show you real quickly, basically this is defining a bunch of variables that are going to be used within the collection itself. Nothing really to change here, so we can go ahead and close this. Now we'll go to collections and we'll say import. And we'll do the same thing, upload files. This time we'll pick the collection, hit open, hit import. Okay, so now you can see that we have the Race Manager collection. Once it's imported, you'll see this little arrow on the left. Go ahead and click on that. That'll drop it down. The way the collection within Postman is organized is very much in the same way the resources are laid out within the application or the API layer itself. So the first thing to say is there's admin and public related endpoints. So public is essentially any endpoint that you can interact with that does not require any sort of authentication. Which generally speaking is just the some of the event data. So if you're using Automobile 2 and you're running your own dedicated server, it's writing all of the events that happen during the races to a specific log file, the stats file. And what Race Manager is one of its big benefits is actually that it will manage Automobile 2 dedicated server for you. So it will start it whenever you start this server, and then it will do things like continuously pull the log file to pull the latest data into Race Manager. So there's really two endpoints, right? This one that says get live. You can see that basically this is the URL that it's going to call, and you can see that it's actually using what looks like a variable, right? That variable there is coming from the environment file, but you can see it's red right now, which is basically showing that it's unresolved. That's because we haven't picked an environment. So when you come into Race Manager, we need to set the environment that we're using, and so we do that by going to the right hand side and picking that Race Manager environment. Now you'll see the red has gone away and it's just got this orange, and you can see that if I hover over it, it's actually showing that variable that gets pulled in from the environment. So if I go ahead and run this just to show you what this looks like, so hitting send will basically send this HTTP request to the server. So you have to make sure you do have the server running in the background when you're doing this. At the bottom, you're going to see this payload that comes back from the request. All the API endpoints return JSON responses, so you should really be able to interact with those or parse those in pretty much any language that you want. So it says get live, and so what this is doing, it's actually reading the data directly from the Automobile 2 live stats file at the moment, the one that's actually sitting on disk, and it's giving you back the current data that's in that. But again, one of the big benefits is Race Manager is actually pulling this endpoint for you at about a 1 second interval, and then it's actually historically saving this data within a Mongo database, and then it's relating it back to other interesting things like the rotation that was in use at the time, the session or the like the race series that you've created within the UI generally. And so this is nice because now you'll be able to have pretty much a full unlimited history of all the race data over time, and you'll be able to go back and kind of compare it to different tracks, different weather conditions, you know, how your friends did, all that sort of stuff, which is really the key benefit. Okay, so let's talk about the admin endpoint now. So basically the first thing to call out is if I just browse into one of these things, you see that anything under this admin folder is generally going to, well, is definitely going to start with a /admin resource endpoint. So basically anytime you submit a request to a /admin endpoint, no matter what it is, you're going to require a basic authentication. And to make that easy within Postman, you can basically click on the folder, not the arrow, it'll collapse. You want to do it the right hand side of this particular folder element. And what you're going to see now is this admin tab, and this is going to basically allow you to do some setting configuration for everything that lives underneath this particular folder, so all of the admin requests. I've already set this up, but you're going to need to change this for your username and password. So part of configuring the server, if you remember, was setting what you want your admin username and password to be. This is already set to basic authentication, so you leave that alone. Down here is where you're going to actually change your username and password to be whatever you want. And make sure after you've changed it, just for example, if I say 2, you'll see there's a little orange indicator up here, which means I have an unsaved change. So I'll change it back. As soon as I hit that save button, now it will go away. That means this is particularly safe. So this is right for me right now in my test environment. So that's all we really need to do here. So we'll go ahead and close that. And now all the requests that get submitted underneath this particular folder will use that data, right? So when you use the API directly, you need to pass that information in the headers. So next thing to call out is that as part of the security that's enabled on the server, you need to use a special kind of token. It's a uniquely created, generated number that validates that the request was initiated from generally the UI. This is just for added security in the application. It's called XSRF. And so there's a couple different ways to get one of these. You don't need to use these on any request that is like an HTTP GET, but there are different types of HTTP requests, right? There are POST, GET, PUT, DELETE, PATCH. For our particular use case, any GET request, it doesn't have any side effect or doesn't modify any data, it just pulls back data, and so it doesn't require this extra layer of security. But something like a POST request does. And so how do you get that cookie value set into your request so that your request will succeed? To make this easy, I've done that for you at the top level. So if you click on the race manager bucket at the top and you go to this pre-request script, what you're going to see here is effectively this is a request that happens before every other request in the collection. All it's really doing is it's hitting the main server endpoint, and that's going to just return back like a welcome to race manager type message, but it's also going to return back a cookie value. Okay, so let's come down and go ahead and pretend to create a session here. So if I click on this guy, a couple things to call out. The first one is the body, right? So most of these requests already have sample data pre-filled out to show you the parameters they accept. Eventually we'll have a full Swagger documentation with all of these complete. But a couple things I'm going to call out here. So the first one is the headers, right? So you can see this, one of the headers that gets passed through, and this is that token that I talked about. We need to get that token value, right? And so that's what that pre-request script is doing for us. So it is going out and getting a fresh request. It generates a fresh token, it sets it in a cookie, it gives us back to us, and now we're including that in our next request. Otherwise it would fail without, not only does it have to be a valid token, but it has to be within a certain amount of time so that it can be validated as a valid request. And so now that we have that token set up, right, that's going to run before every one of our requests. So I'm just trying to show you how that works behind the scenes, but it's not something you generally have to worry about when you're using the Postman collection itself. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a new race session. So send that request through, you'll see the payload. This is great, so it worked for us, it gave us a unique ID. And so generally now, if you want to interact with this race session from an API perspective, you always need that ID to get back to it, whether you want to update it and change the name, whether you want to delete it, or just get the details back about it. So rather than track this, there's another variable trick that's being used here. So what you'd see if I go to the test tab on this particular one is it gets this same body back into the into the program itself, and then it sets another variable in our environment called the last generated session ID, and it just tracks this ID, right? So this is just basically so that you don't have to grab this ID and memorize it or put it back into these other requests. It's just going to simulate that for you. So if I go back to get details, basically what you would see is it's going to use the variable that we just set in our previously created session. So if I was to send this back, now we're going to get the details of that same session we just created, and you can see it's the same ID and it's all the same details. I could come in and I could run an update here, which just allows me to maybe change the name and add some additional dummy data for race rotation IDs. So if I was to come in and do that, let's go ahead and do that. So we run this, and you can see it successfully updated the race session. And if I wanted to, I could come in and delete the session. It doesn't actually delete the session. The deletes are always a soft delete, so it'll no longer appear as an active session or a valid session within the application itself, but you don't lose the history or any of the race data that was attached to that particular session. So then we have the game server. So game server resource endpoints are generally those that interact directly with Automobilista 2. So again, this Race Manager server is starting on Automobilista 2 dedicated server for you, and it's allowing you to do things like just verify that startup process has actually happened. So you can see that yes, it's currently running. It did start it up for us. We could do things like restart that server if we were having issues with it, which would, in the UI essentially be able to go in and just click a button to restart it, or stop it or start it, right? But the game server does need to be running, obviously, for Race Manager to do most of its functionality, like generating rotations and things like that. So next are rotations, right? So rotations are the interesting part about creating like series or race events, right? You generate a rotation of like a certain number of races, you pick a class of car, you pick a weather condition, on and on and on. We don't currently let you build a full custom rotation, but that is on our roadmap. Right now what we do is we support giving a few basic properties. If I come in here and show you the body, so you can basically do things like you can specify the number of races that you'd like to have. Then you can, we generally don't like to race with carts, so we have a higher level option that allows you to turn carts off completely, which basically means you won't get cart tracks or carts themselves as cars. And the last two options are for persist and restart. So if you say persist false, then essentially what's going to happen here is that you would get you could get a rotation generated for you, get that data back, and it would be a valid rotation, but it's not actually saved into the system. So this might be just like generating a rotation and sharing it or something else without actually making it the rotation that you want to be live in the server right now. But if you do say persist, then this will effectively generate a brand new rotation file, put that in the right place in the Automobilista server for you, and then on the next server restart, it would be picked up, and that would be your active rotation that you're playing. And so that's why this other option is here, which is the restart. So if you choose to do a restart true when you say persist, then it will actually write that new rotation file off and restart the server, which will give you that rotation active right now. And so you don't really need to touch Automobilista 2 directly to make that happen. You can also choose to generate rotations with a custom name. If you don't, you just get a unique identifier, but you probably want a name just so you can easily identify it later. And like I said, for now, it's basically just generating like a fun random rotation for you to play with however many races you want in it. It does process these rotations, and it does correlate them to all of the races that are happening, right? So if you did 15 races against this particular rotation, then all of that race data will be tracked to this rotation, right? And eventually you'll be able to swap rotations in and out or add them to different sessions, share them with the community, and create a lot of really fun events that way. And again, you can get rotation details. So when I created that new rotation, just like before, it would have set a new value for us, which would have been the last generate rotation ID. If I go ahead and submit that, you see that there's this is actually just the default rotation, because I didn't generate one. Let's go ahead and generate a new race rotation. This will actually take a second because it goes through all that data. It does generate a large file. It does write that off the disk, and then it does restart the server for us. So now if I come back and I do this last generated rotation ID, you'll see it actually has data inside of it, and you can see that it did do some generation. So like it identified here's a track it picked and the weather that it picked and all of those types of details, right? And it would have done this for 10 races since that's what we specified. Configuration is pretty self-explanatory. It doesn't do much at this point, but basically you can do things like change the server name, which would be persisted back into your race manager file. And then you can also change the active session or the active rotation, right? So again, the idea is you can have different events going at different times with your friends, and you can easily swap which event you want to play, or swap out which rotation within an event you want to play. When you're using our UI that comes along with Race Manager, this is kind of the meat and potatoes of what it's trying to achieve for you, is to give you a lot of interesting ways to build those and combinations, and then to also like see the history and the performance against those. And then now we have the events. This one you probably won't use much, but essentially this is the ability to call the API and have it immediately process the race data file from Automobilista 2. Again, this happens while the server's running. This happens once every second anyway, generally. So it's not something you're going to actually do much, but effectively this gives you a way to get the latest data parsed into the database, and it avoids any sort of duplication by default. This last one here is really just the a way to call and get that token that we talked about earlier for security manually. But again, generally you're not going to need to do this. This is just here so you can see it as a reference point. But this is basically the same thing that happens again at the top level. So that's it for the API review now. Hopefully that's helpful. If you have any feedback, please let us know. Have fun.